Here is 3 Oysters, Dancheong, a red ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This red performs just as a red should, though it looks a lot like every other red from a ballpoint pen. It has some tone shift as papers change and very little shading, though it does shade while it isn't a thing for red inks commonly. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it does well enough, which is really an understatement, to be used as an editing or a corrective ink. I can easily see this as a good go-to for a red ink, as it isn't screaming, but it's simply drawing the eye to a particular area. Sadly, I won't get a bottle as I currently have a preferred red, but I will be happy keeping this in mind for the future. The pen for today is a TWSBI Mini with a fine nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Here we see a great red that is not searing on the eyes to look at. It's not gentle as a red, but it's a nice mid tone of that red, really doing perfectly on the page with no feathering, with no spread. It does have some light shading. While that's not my thing for red inks, I can accept it when it's there. Take a look at Hospitality on the first line, where the H is a little bit darker than the OS, but the pit in the middle gets a little bit darker. The alley lightens up a little bit, but the T at the end, TY, does darken. So it did quite a good job shading, much more than we would really expect for most red inks. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is 3 Oysters, Black Moss. Here is 3 Oysters, Mustard. Here is 3 Oysters, Grayoul Hanoil. Here is 3 Oysters, Hang Toe. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. We have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It has a little bit of shading, which if you wanted to, you could call it magnificent, like Magnificent on the second line, where the M is darker than the A, but the G darkens up a little bit, lightening into the NI, darkening at the FIC, and the ant at the end starts to lighten up until the T, where it darkens. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and the great story continues. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Here, the tone on the page is slightly lighter, but not very different, just slightly lighter as a tone. There's no feather, there is no spread. There's 1 or 2 spots of shading. Otherwise, I really wouldn't call this a shading ink. Like the D on Friend in the first line is quite a bit darker, but for the most part, this is all a uniform tone with only a couple darker spots. So if you don't care for a shading red, and you like how it's looking on this paper, it makes it a very good match. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, outstanding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It shades less than it did on the Clairfontaine. But most importantly, the quad rule. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, really letting that melt into the background and having your writing be the important thing on the page. Again, I said it shades less. If we take a look at hardships on the third line, you see that part of the H is dark and part is light. It darkens into the AR, lightens a little bit, but a very dark ships at the end. And right next to that is fairly light, where Adventures next to that shows a little bit of that shading back and forth, darker to lighter again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. So all good news. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters, their number 12. Here is Birmingham Pen Company George Westinghouse Alternator Crimson. Here is Califolio Rubies. Here is Colorverse Dirty Red. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine, albeit slightly flatter as a tone. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, has a very light seasoning of shading throughout. You can see it with like there, with the H, or the top of the H on the first line. You see it in the third line with the T of but for the most part, not much for shading. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, still making this great for student use. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, so we can happily continue our lab notes. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Teatramentis Deepwater Obsession Blue Black. Here is Pilot Fuyu Soyugan, or Rigor of Winter. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Cobalt Blue. Here is Visconti Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The tone here is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really isn't vivid, but is definitely a red there, with very little feathering, very little spread, very little shading, just doing actually a very good job as a red ink on this horrible paper. Probably a good match here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get very deep into the paper quite frequently, but it never touches the page underneath. You just couldn't write on the back of the page. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The dry fine of the TWSBI Mini shows just how good this ink is in tone and general performance, as a dry fine can easily expose an ink's weaknesses. Now, off camera, I tried this in a wet fine to darken it up, which it did, along with eliminating any shading, which was generally satisfying, but it became less friendly to cheap papers. So for that reason, I stick with a dry fine for its overall good performance on all papers. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.